Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone who has joined from around the world. Welcome to the discussion, Great Power Competition in the Baltic Sea region. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Embassy of Latvia, a select few here in person, and the rest, many people virtually from both sides of the Atlantic and maybe even beyond. This discussion is jointly organized by the Embassy of Latvia and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. My name is Sarma Ginter, Third Secretary at the Embassy of Latvia, and it's my honor to be the moderator for today's event. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to His Excellency Māris Selga, Ambassador of Latvia to the United States of America.
So we are moving computers. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, good morning or afternoon to everyone who has joined us online, and welcome those who are here in person at our embassy. The title of today's discussion is Great Power Competition in the Baltic region. And as you probably know, Latvia is no stranger to great power competition. In fact, great powers have been competing over our country and territory since ancient times. So our history is full of such examples. We know that around 2000 BC, Baltic tribes began to live on what is now modern-day Latvia. One of the largest trading routes of that time went through our territory. The location of the Baltics was and still is very strategic. During these years, trade with the region developed along with the languages, traditions, and knowledge of the Balts. The location of Baltic territories was also one of the reasons Northern Crusaders fought for influence through Christianization process. From then on, many great powers have fought over our territory, from Sweden and Denmark to Germany and Poland to Russia and beyond. It is well known that Peter the Great was motivated by his belief that Russia needs an exit to the Baltic Sea or a window to Europe. In the 19th, 18th, and 20th centuries, the exit to the Baltic Sea and strategic location of Baltics fueled many conflicts among great powers. Looking at history, some may be surprised that Latvia managed to become an independent country. During the World War I, and shortly after, our territory housed armies of Poles, Russians, White Russians, Red Russians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Germans, and others. Yet our small nation managed to win and proclaim independence in 1918. Unfortunately, competition over Latvia did not end in 1918. On June 17, 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Latvia. Today marks 81 years since the tragic event. But today we can be grateful that on June 17, we can speak of 3 Baltic countries. We speak of independent, democratic, and free nations. We are proud members of the United Nations, European Union, NATO, OECD, and other organizations. Our country plays an important role in international relations that extends beyond security and Russian deterrence. We are strong advocates of human rights, digitalization, media literacy, climate awareness, and contribute to development assistance programs for other countries, especially Eastern Partnership countries. We remain aware of the important role we play in geopolitics and the role of great power competition in our region. Beyond traditional security, this extends to a vast amount of issues such as infrastructure, technology, 5G, and climate. Today's topic also intersects with recent events, including the G7 summit and NATO summit, President Biden's visit to Europe, and his meeting with President Putin. All of these events influence Latvia and the Baltic region, so today's discussion is very timely. One more thing from my personal experience. In 1993, I applied for a course on regional security organized by Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Surprisingly, I was accepted, and at the beginning of October, just 2 days after my wedding, I arrived in Stockholm, where I and my Baltic colleagues were greeted by Dr. Gunilla Herolf, one of today's panelists. So I would like to thank Sweden and Utrikespolitiska Institute for bringing me into the world of foreign relations. Dear Dr. Herolf, dear Dr. Hamilton, and Dr. Bukovskis, welcome to the Embassy of Latvia in the United States of America. We all look forward to hearing the thoughts of our distinguished panelists, and I thank the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for collaborating with us on this event. and may we have a fruitful and thoughtful, provoking discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for these thoughtful remarks and for providing also historical context. And really, what an interesting coincidence that on this day, June 17th, when it's a sad day for the Baltic countries, yet we sit here and talk about 3 democratic nations. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, today, we are joined by 3, as the ambassador said, distinguished panelists, distinguished scholars. Among themselves, they share decades of research and experience, and are definitely people we can learn from in this context and on this topic. I would like to introduce the panelists in the order that they will be speaking, and then I will invite them to give remarks of around 10 minutes. Following that, we will have a question and answer session. For everyone joining us virtually, please, in the question and answer box, feel free to introduce yourself and pose your questions. We will try to answer as many as possible at the end. So today we are joined by Dr. Danielle S. Hamilton, Director of the Global Europe Program at Wilson Center, Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome. Then we have Dr. Gunilla Herolf from the other side of the Atlantic, joining us from Sweden. As we heard, also an acquaintance of Ambassador Selga. She is Senior Associate Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, former researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And finally, Dr. Karlis Bukovskis, who is Fulbright Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is also the Deputy Director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. This is a great panel, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on great power competition in the Baltic Sea region. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Danielle Hamilton. If you could please start us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're having a video issue. The host needs to unblock my video, but in order to save time, I think we should just start. I want to thank the embassy, and I want to thank my colleague Karlis, who's been with us at Johns Hopkins SAIS as a visiting scholar, for being part of this event. This is a hybrid event. We have guests here and colleagues here in the room, so I feel I should be speaking out to them while I'm looking at the screen at the same time. But since the screen is blank, I can talk to you directly. June 17th, as you said, is quite a day in history for Latvia. I lived a long time in the divided city of Berlin, and June 17th is also an important day in terms of uprising in East Berlin in the 50s, which was commemorated. It was, in fact, the German, wasn't a holiday, it was the German National Day until unification. So it has a sad date, but it's also my wedding anniversary. So you can see what I do on my wedding anniversary, but it can have some high points as well. Anyway, I was asked to speak to this topic, but also in the context of US views of the Baltic region. I think a lot of people ask, why does the United States pay attention to countries of such small size? And I think if you look at our history together, you see the US has always had a strong appreciation of countries that may be small in size but stand tall, particularly for the principles that your country does stand for, and that your success in building democracy, helping to support democratic development around the world, not just in your region, has been important to the United States. It helps to refresh our own sense of our purpose and our national interests. and particularly, as you may know, I was involved a lot in helping the Baltic states integrate into the mainstream of Europe as allies in NATO, very strong partners for us. I think it's also important for the United States that Baltic voices are represented in other European councils, including the European Union, because strong Baltic voices in the EU help to shape the debates within the European Union toward an EU that is outward-looking, Atlanticist, and can be an EU that can be America's counterpart, rather than an EU without Baltic voices that maybe would tend to be more inward-looking. And though there are those who argue that it should maybe be America's counterweight. So I think we value, even though we're not in those discussions, I think we value the Baltic role in the European Union. So I think if you think of Baltic history, all these dates you've mentioned, but other better dates, the Baltics represent, I think, for many Americans, the best of a Europe that could be truly whole, free, and at peace with itself. So I don't say that just to flatter. I think it really has had a meaning for us. So we stand now at a new threshold, a new administration here, and trying to get our partnership revitalized after some turbulent times. But I think it would be a mistake to think we just go back to business as usual. I think that's not appropriate for the moment. The president has just come back from Europe, a whole set of important summits, and I think sort of helped show us a way forward together. So I think there are a number of areas where we should think now about what our next steps are together. Clearly the priority, despite the fact we're all here in a room shaking hands with no masks, is we have to move our societies and our economies from sickness to health. Clearly that is still number one, no doubt about it. And I know in many parts of Europe, there's still great struggle, as there is still in the United States, in many parts of the United States. We lead with NATO because we are allies in NATO. We just had a NATO summit. I think it was an important summit, and it reaffirmed not only the importance of US commitment to NATO, Article 5 in particular, but had meat in it in terms of defense and deterrence elements going forward, which I think are particularly important for the Baltic region and Baltic countries. We can come back to that if you'd like. I think what was interesting to me, a topic I've been pushing very hard, but I think the Alliance is doing more on the concept of resilience. That the kind of security challenges we face today, and I think the Baltic states are sometimes in the front line of this, are disruptive challenges to how our societies operate, how open societies work, everything that keeps us together, all the flows that keep us together, whether it's keeping the electricity on, goods, services, people, energy, the internet, are subjected today to disruptive influence. And that is a security challenge, but it's not like the other ones we're used to. It's not about tank armies. It's about creating new mechanisms of being resilient to these types of challenges. And not only for our alliance, but also thinking about how we have to be resilient together. My challenge to NATO has been that it has been focused on only allied resilience. And it's usually interpreted as Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which is self-help. And so our baseline requirements, each country should show that it's resilient. But how can you be resilient in the Europe that we know if your neighbor's not? Why aren't we working more on shared resilience? And if it's only for allies in the Europe we know, how do we think NATO could actually be resilient? What about Ukraine? What about your neighbors just close to you? If they are not resilient, all of the things that will be disruptive will flow back into your countries. So it seems to me we need to project resilience forward to countries that are not necessarily allies, but whose security matter to us, including close partners. So I believe NATO has taken some step, but as it redoes its strategic concept, this concept of shared and forward resilience should be part of a new core task for NATO. We should lift resilience as another core task of the alliance. And I think the Baltic states, because you are so much affected by that, I would hope we could work on that in particular together. I think there was good news on military mobility, which is really important to Baltic defense, and important on allowing the US to participate in some EU defense arrangements. It had been problematic in the past, but seems to be moving forward now. And I think that's a good sign for us all working together. I think the US-EU summit was important. Mainly, my colleague Jason is here. He just wrote a good piece where he compared the US-EU summit. Jason, I'm going to steal your line, to the Washington Metro. A few years ago, the Washington Metro was not really working too well. And their message to everyone who depended on it to work was, well, we'll get it back to good. Not really good, not really perfect, but kind of functioning. That was the best they could promise. And I think the summit with the EU, we got maybe back to good. It's first actions to get that relationship to be more functional than it has. And I recommend Jason's piece, which will be on the Wilson Center website today. So I think the best way to think about the US-EU summit was it was first actions, first steps, and creating new kinds of mechanisms, again, in which I think it points to that type of outward-looking Atlanticist Europe that we hope for. The other big challenge we still have is the legacy, back to Russia, great power competition, the legacy of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, in which infrastructure ran east to west across Europe. There still is a gap in how you can do north to south infrastructure in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, and that was the legacy. So the more we can do to build that up, that's why military mobility is important, but also the 3 Cs initiative, all of the types of infrastructure things we could do together, where the US is not going to play the leading role, but we will be part of the role, I think is really important, particularly for the security of the Baltic states. The other area where particularly Russia is involved is what I call the gray zone of Central and Eastern Europe, the countries that don't know where their future lies. Belarus is front and center right now. The Baltic states have taken the lead on how guiding us in the best response to what Lukashenko is doing. And I hope we can stay together on that. But I want to highlight again the strategic importance of Ukraine, because I do believe, frankly, the way Ukraine goes is the way Europe will go. It's not normally what people say, but I think it is central. It's not peripheral to Europe's future. And then on the topic at hand, most of what I've discussed all have to do with Russia, clearly, in the backdrop. But let me at least mention China, because I think that's the new element. Much of the media played up the NATO summit as if it was all about China. It wasn't really. There were some interesting, relevant references to China, but most of the NATO summit was about Russia. But it did mention China. And I think it's not about NATO going to the Indo-Pacific. It's about China coming to the Atlantic. And I think that's the better way to think about it if we see what's happening. China is a world-class actor. Its very nature creates ripples now globally, including in Europe, whether it's investment in strategic companies, ports, just all of that type of thing. There have been mechanisms, 17, now 16 plus 1. And I think we need to be careful about how China engages in parts of Europe. And particularly whatever we call it now, 16, 17 plus 1, has been a challenge, I think. And it's interesting to see now Baltic states and others stepping back from that type of arrangement, which we could talk about. The last point I would just make is how China and Russia interact have implications for us. And it's not necessarily that they have a alliance or a partnership, but which in many ways they have things going on together. I think what's the implication though for security in Europe is that on the margin, that type of relationship may change Russia's risk calculus. I think that's the thing for me that would be the most important element, that on the margin, if you come to a tense situation, Russia's risk calculus, thinking China is sort of with it, might be different than if it didn't think that. And that has, for a big neighbor on your border, that might have some implications. I think Europe is looking to Joe Biden to sort of get everything back on track. I would just end by saying we should look to Europe to understand where Europe wants to go as well. And there I come back to the Baltic states, because you often help guide the way to help keep us refreshed, revitalized with what's really important. And I would argue that don't just look to America to point the way. We want to know where you want to go too. But we're at a moment now, it's not a moment to think small. It's not a moment to hedge our bets, thinking in 2 years things will change. It's a time to lock in what we can for the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for these very interesting thoughts spanning Russia, China, resilience. You really managed to cover a lot of topics, and I look forward to exploring this further in our question and answer session. I would like to invite now Gunilla, if you could turn your video on and unmute and share your thoughts with us about this topic.
Thank you very much, Sarma. Thank you very much to you all for inviting me and for the excellent introductions of Ambassador Selga and Dr. Hamilton. And I must say to the ambassador that I remember the 8-week course we had in Stockholm with a lot of pleasure. It was good to see you all, and it has been great to see you all afterwards. You were a number of very smart young people, and you had excellent careers afterwards. Always great to meet you. Yes, as you mentioned, both the situation in the Baltic Sea region now is problematic. We have, during the last 10 years only, experienced Russian cyber attacks. We have seen simulated bomb attacks. We have seen, excuse me, many kinds of aggressive Russian behavior, and including also the non-military ones like information war. And as Dr. Hamilton says, it is testing our resilience day after day. We see China too, a country which seems to use investments as a means to take control and to weaken European countries. We see the 5G technology is a big concern for us due to the relation between companies in China and the military. These are different countries, very different, but both promote their own goals in ways that are detrimental to the rest of us. None of them has given very much value to what we see as important as human rights and the rule of law. This is problematic in many ways, I would say. So now to the theme of today. What should be the next steps for the United States and its partners in the Baltic Sea region? And here I will be talking very much about the military side first, at least. The institutional division between us is well known. Norway, Denmark, and Iceland being members of NATO, whereas Finland and Sweden and Denmark again are members of EU. I would argue, however, that this division is becoming increasingly less important as the integration is proceeding in the north. The first steps of close cooperation were taken in 2007. In 2008, we had the cross-border training between Norway, Sweden, and Finland, which means that the three air forces every week since 2008 are practicing together in the airspace above the Nordic countries in the far north. In 2009, the 5 countries established the Nordic Defence Cooperation, where also a great many agreements have been made. And in its vision to 2025 now, the ambition has been stated to cooperate also in crises and conflicts, and to cooperate even more with the United States and with the 3 Baltic countries. Furthermore, we have an agreement between Finland, Norway, and Sweden, taken only half a year ago, where the 3 countries will now start joint military national planning in order to conduct coordinated military operations during crises and conflicts, starting in the north. But the closest cooperation, however, is between Finland and Sweden. It covers already crisis and wartime, and it has no predetermined limits. At present, there are no mutual defense obligations, but several agreements have been made to speed up national decisions when taking actions to help protecting the territorial borders of the other countries. So as I see it, this ongoing Nordic integration should contribute to raising the threshold for aggression in the Baltic Sea region, and of course against our own countries. Cooperation between us in the north and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania must also be strong. Historically, it is strong. In terms of defense, however, less so, considering that we are not all members of NATO. But here we have tried to make our own efforts to strengthen it. Finland has declared itself as bound by the EU's Article 42.7, which is about defense guarantee. Sweden has given its own unilateral solidarity declaration saying that if anything happens to you, Sweden will not remain passive, and it has elaborated on this a lot. And then including the United States and NATO. All European countries, without any exceptions, see the United States as crucial for their territorial defense, the territorial defense of the whole of Europe. Also Finland and Sweden. And the links between these 2 countries and the United States are many, many. I can't enumerate them here. In 2018, a trilateral agreement was made between the 3 countries, with one of the purposes being to build interoperability through training and exercises. The ambition here is mirrored by a large number of big exercises that have been taken place during the last few years. The aims are to develop capabilities to act together, to raise deterrence, and to practice more among us, not least the host nation support, which is the very important agreement that Finland and Sweden have entered with NATO. Then I would also claim that while dependence on United States and NATO is strong, there is also dependence in the other direction. Excuse me. United States and NATO is dependent on the Nordic countries' territories for the crisis in the north. In addition, Nordic air forces, which are in place through the combat training, may also act as bridging mission before others arrive. And furthermore, access to Swedish and maybe also other Nordic countries' territory is important for NATO in order to give help to the Baltic to the Baltic crisis in case they are attacked. And then there are also the threats in the south. We have the crucial Danish Straits here, and we have Denmark also active in the Baltic air policing and the enhanced forward pressure. Also important, I would say, is that each country has its own individual responsibility here. Sweden has in particular responsibility for the island of Gotland, which is central for the defense of the whole region. And Finland has, throughout this period, been keeping a strong territorial defense, also when others like Sweden disarmed. And then a few more points. We have other friends as well. United States is a truly important one, but we have, apart from the Baltic and Nordic ones, we have Poland, Germany, Netherlands, UK, all meeting in the Northern Group based on the Northern perspective. We have the three big ones, France, Germany, UK. The UK in particular, I would say, very much through its high readiness joint expeditionary force, which is seen as useful in grey zone activities, but also as a possible means in a bridging mission in the Baltic Sea. We have the EU, and as Dr. Hamilton also mentioned, the military mobility is tremendously important for both the EU and NATO. Here they have very much to gain by working together, and the same goes for cyber. There are troubles as well, or challenges, I would say, like strategic autonomy. Where will it go? Will United States like what they see? And will all European countries like what they see? We are not totally in agreement on this particular concept. It's a highly controversial one, I would say. Then, very final words. There is a battle going on in the world between authoritarianism and democracy. China and Russia today perceive themselves to be on the winning side. And our most important task is to prevent them from driving in wedges between us and destroy our society, which is definitely the Russian goal. And this ambition for us goes both for the Baltic Sea region and for the whole of Europe and the world. And there I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Herolf, for these words, for bringing the Nordic perspective, especially your thoughts on individual responsibility. And finally, yes, democracy and authoritarianism. And this is probably one of the reasons we are also here having these types of discussions and trying to find solutions. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Bukovskis, please.
So the microphone is mine, right? Good morning or good evening, depends on where you are. I'm honored to be part of this event, and I'm deeply thankful to both the School of Advanced International Studies and the Latvian Embassy in the United States for the opportunity to hold this discussion in the first place. Have a bit less than 10 minutes, so I will try to provide a quick explanation on how the Baltic states think about the world, if I may. We already have heard excellent presentations from Dan and Gunilla, and so I can assure you I will not repeat those things. I will say a couple of more additional ones. So first of all, 2 points. One, how they are framing the international partnerships, especially with the United States and the Nordic countries. And then, of course, also the stage of geopolitical evolution, where we are and how we're placed in the world currently. So let's start with the first one, which is it is clear that the Baltic states are small countries and geographically marginal. Those things influence understandings. It influences how we perceive the world, where we perceive ourselves, so to speak. The mapping process, right? We're barely recognizable in the world. That's another thing, because again, if you ask people to point out where we are, then it's going to be rather tricky in many places in the world to even locate. They do not have highly profitable natural resources or energy resources. Well, land and forest, that we have, but that again is valuable in a bigger climate change perspective rather than immediate economic benefits. Well, high and quick economic benefits, oil and gas wise, I mean. Baltic states are self-aware of their smallness, and at the same time, they're still trying to punch above their weight, right? And but only in the issues in which they feel credible. Sometimes as an analyst, it's sometimes even annoying to see how good ideas are being drawn down to earth, so to speak, and at the end forgotten just for the simple reason that, yeah, well, we're not going to have enough credibility on this issue, and that is one of the challenging moments. From the geopolitical point of view, so to speak, academically speaking, if I may, well, small state foreign policy options are limited, right? So we joined international organizations, UN, naturally, NATO, European Union, and its Eurozone, if I may say so. Those were essential, of course, in order to have this framework in which to operate further on, right? To cover the bases, so to speak. OECD membership, that was for prestige, largely, right? I don't believe that that's much of a secret. Partners are essential, the United States in particular. And it's not only because the United States in the beginning of the 90s was the sole remaining superpower after the Cold War ended, but it's also because, and it has been raised already in the context, has been raised already today, because US de facto and de jure did not recognize the occupation of the Baltic states, and that assisted, of course, with rebuilding the states and reclaiming the states, and now celebrating the centenaries. And now now we are shielded by the US, if I may use this expression, and therefore the strategic partnership is there. Other partners, well, Nordic countries are indispensable. They have trusted in the Baltic development. Am I being too optimistic about this? Yeah, well, we can discuss this afterwards. But it's not only the Finnish-Estonian special relationships. It's, well, Sweden has been often an example and definitely a source of strategic and systemic banking in the Baltics. Again, there are some of the things which are not always easy and are discussable. But if we look at the general picture, then this is the case. And strategic partner economically, Germany, of course, that must not be forgotten. I believe that that one does not have to name the reason why the Baltic states are acting the way they are, why are they eagerly searching for friends, right? It has been mentioned a couple of times already, and yes, I'm going to be provocative, we are Russophobes. I can admit it. I'm an analyst, I can admit it, but it's a phobia. It's a phobia in its original sense. It's a fear. It's not a dislike. Right, so there is an actual fear of potential Russian aggression, and this is still there, especially since 2014. This hasn't is not only not disappeared, this has come back on the agenda more and more actively. And the way Russia is acting, especially within the past decades, well, Baltics see the need to protect themselves, right? Safeguard the existing world order, and this world order is international law based. It is multilateralism, and it is strong and united West, both the European Union and the US. These are the safeguards for our understanding and our independence. So the central goal of the Baltics has always been to provide the understanding that we are trustworthy partners, right? That we are a safe and safe long-term investment for our partners, right? To get friends, right? And for 30 years, we have been basically going on this path. I just finished an article in which I was identifying the 4 stages of modern Baltic state rebuilding process, right? And so I kind of looked back at the 1990 till 1995 as the post-Soviet period, post-Soviet stage, the initial transformation, then the EU accession stage, which had its totally different already sentiments in the practical life. The EU learning stage from 2005 until 2014, and now starting 2015, I'm claiming that this is international self-assertiveness stage of the Baltic states, if I may say so. It's more proactive, more visible we are becoming. And this leads to the second point very quickly. The Baltic states, within the self-assertiveness period, of course, have to get rid of the foreign policy shyness. In this case, skills, there's international position, there's accumulated know-how, which quite much exceeds the actual activity levels that the Baltic states are very often projecting. Baltics are good employees, if I may say so, but not necessarily always good entrepreneurs, at least not yet. In the form that we are very eager to do the right thing. We are very eager to improve ourselves and to help partners. But at the same time, our activity and proactivity levels are still to be developed. So good quality work as a trustworthy partners, but the work is barely visible, if I may say so. And I hope embassy is not going to mind that I'm saying that. So there are some expectations towards the Baltic states by the partners, at least in my mind. First and foremost, not to mess it up. There is a symbolic value of our achievements from the US side, how the US sees it. There's a transformative power of the European Union that has been where we are of what we are evidence. And there is a socialization power of the Nordics and Germany as well present in the Baltic states. Evolution from post-Soviet economic and political devastation into good countries, if I may put it very bluntly, this is how we have seen it and where we are. We're not a failed project, and so in this case, building a positive popular image internationally, that's not only essential, but it's also insufficient. And we need to take more stock in the foreign policy issues. The world is no longer only about the Baltic states, as we're often very much looking outwards, and we're looking that, yeah, everybody's talking only about us. Everybody's doing that, right? Meaning not only the Baltic states are doing that, every country thinks that they're at the center of the world. But in this case, we are, again, the mapping process, right? And so in this case, what is happening is that we need to think not only about ourselves, but also we should not look at the world only and exclusively in the context of Russia. One visible example, which has been mentioned quite often, China is much more powerful competitor than Russia is. China has the economic, political, and military capacity to substitute West. It's basically to fill in the structural void in places where the West no longer is. China has that capacity. In case of Russia, I don't believe that. Russia's presence in the world is sporadic, and most often destructive. Sorry, but this is just that, the way how I see it. So in order to make another provocation, Baltics need to turn from Russophobes to Sinophobes. More assertiveness and international voice, we have seen already. We have mentioned in the case of Belarus that we have seen in the past few years. Lithuania's, if I may say so, walkout from the 17+1 format and Parliament calling out human rights violations of Uyghurs in China. Latvia turning against Belarus. We can discuss the methods, but putting down the foot was definitely the thing that needed to be done. And Estonia currently being an active non-permanent member of the UN Security Council are just a few of the examples. One final point, I'm out of time, right? Yes, one final point. As President Biden also just said, international relations are about personalities, right? So in this case, being in a room with quite many of my Baltic colleagues, for our own sake, we need to do one thing, and we have to have a strong political personality representing the region, at least one per particular moment of time, right? Because it's not only about sending the message, but also selling the message. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Karlis, and thank you for your openness. Now, yes, I would like to invite our audience joining in to please use the Q&A option below. We have already received a few questions. I will pose the first one to our audience. The question is, how is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa impacting the global landscape? And regarding to superpowers, will there be shifts? I think we already covered Russia, China. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps Brazil, South Africa? Are there any other countries that are emerging in the region. Dr. Bukovskis, would you like to take this question?
Yes, sure, gladly take. Well, yes, of course, it's Russia, China. Well, technically, if we look at the general world, we can see somewhat 3 or 4 centers, right? So it's the Western world, and in this case, depending, I'm sorry, on the U.S. administration, it's either the U.S. and the European Union or the Western world united. So in this case, that's the one power center. And then, of course, Russia, China, and if we have to not forget the capacities that are lying within the Middle East. We should not forget the capacities that are lying in the countries which have access to resources. We have to always keep in mind that we can have new powers emerging and the situation changing rather rapidly. China wasn't such a big threat 30 years ago. We didn't think about China in the way we are discussing it now. 20 years ago, Russia was seen as a much weaker player, in spite of the fact that it still has and had the military and the nuclear weapons and everything else. It was still wasn't that. And new powers emerging, either of those being part of the BRICS, current BRICS, or outside. This is still an option that is taking place. And so taking sides is always an essential element. So understand, are you with us, or you're in a different position? I hope I managed to answer the question.
Thank you, Dr. Bukovskis. Would you, Dan, like to answer the question as well?
Sure. Let me posit some. If you think of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, I think that was a construct of an earlier period in which we were talking about growing interdependencies as if it was not a repetitive, it's more a different type of world. We are now in a different situation. The BRICS, what are they really? They're not really engaging much as a group anymore. South Africa and India are joining the G7 as guests and participating. The Biden administration is engaging in Brazil, another democracy, challenged tremendously at the moment by its own issues and the pandemic. But these are democratic countries, and they're forming with the United States, the European Union, others, different kinds of variable geometry that I think are more relevant than this type of other construct. And so I even, if I could just get to the basic point of the question, which was other constellations of power. I think we should think about we're entering a new phase. The world, this great power competition phrase starts to get us there, but it really, I think it's problematic because it conflates Russia and China, frankly, as if they were the same challenge, which they're not. Each has a very different space it occupies. Each has to be treated in its own way, and to simply conflate it into this sort of great power competition, I think leads us astray. Also, the notion of a multipolar world, which would be the premise of the BRICS, I think is a misleading term because it assumes that the poles of power are all similar and they're all sort of, on some equal basis interacting with each other, which they're not. We have to understand their differences of power relationships, and that, as far as I can see, what we're seeing is the diffusion of power. There's no poles. The poles is a very misleading term. It's a very state-centric notion. The diffusion of power leads us away from a state-centric notion to kinds of challenge I just mentioned about resilience, that what connects our countries, our states, if you will, is now the contested space. So instead of thinking about state-centric world, we need to think about network-centric world, and we need to overlay the two. And we need to not only think about territorial security, which is still important, but flow security, the security of the flows that bind us, that can be disrupted, especially for open societies. So I think those are better guideposts for the world we're entering than the construct of a BRICS or multipolar or even great power competition. I don't think they quite get to where we are these days.
Thank you, Dan, for these thoughts. I see we have a few questions, and I will just combine these about disinformation. And I'm wondering if perhaps Dr. Herolf, you could answer this. In short, what has been done and what more should be done to fight information war? What about cooperation? Do you have any thoughts on the use of disinformation as a tactic?
It's a very good question, and it's a very, very difficult one. We have to work on different levels, as I see it. We have to work with those who are the senders. We know in many cases who they are. We know even which house they are. It's a special house in St. Petersburg where people are very skillful in sending out false information. Identifying, naming and shaming is one part of it, but they are very clever and they may be very difficult it may be very difficult to get rid of much of this. We have to work on our own technological level to see that they can't enter our companies, which they often do. Also our institutions, as we have seen many examples of. So our technological level must be much higher than those who are against us. Then I think it's also very important that we work with ourselves, that we educate our children at school about what is false information, fake information, and what is real information. They have to be aware of the fact that they can't believe everything they read or see. And this goes also for us grown-ups who are so eager to take up anything that we find on the net. So as a summary, we have to work all the time with those who do it and with ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And if I may start again, there's another question which I think would be perfect for you. It's posed by Atis Lange, and he asks, if Russia plans to attack, will the burnt be first borne by the Nordics, then the Baltics, or the other way? Will all fight together? Is Sweden and Finland de facto in NATO?
Many would say that Finland and Sweden are more active in NATO than many of the others are. Thank you, Artis, my old friend, for the question. What is said, I just read a Swedish defense proposition, is that we can't exclude that a first attack would hit Sweden. Otherwise, it is often believed that the Baltic countries are at the front. Still, what Swedish documents also say is that what happens to the Baltic countries is also happening to us. There is no borderline in between, because we can't, even if we wanted, escape the effects of what happens in any country in the Baltic Sea region. And as also stated in the official documents, the area that concerns Sweden is far larger than Sweden itself. It's about the northern part of Europe, including the Baltic countries, including all the Nordic countries, also the sea areas. It is unavoidable that we are all in it together, regardless of whether we are in NATO or not. Thank you, Atis.
Yes, thank you for this response. We have a question here also from the audience, and if anyone else would like to pose a question, yes. So this question is about what role did will the Biden-Putin summit that took place play now in the region and in terms of great power competition? Would Dr. Bukovskis, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Sarma. Yes, I guess nothing much will change. Well, to be honest, in this case, I think we were all, to some extent, we were waiting for something bigger to happen. At the same time, the fact that nothing too extraordinary happened, and that there were the discussions evidently, well, we didn't see what was happening behind the closed doors. And so again, in 3 to 6 months, we're going to see what has been discussed. There are, of course, some people who probably know better what was the actual discussion in the room. But I think to a large extent, it is the new normal, if I may say so, because everybody now on both sides, I guess, not only Russia but also the US is realizing that there is partnership is not going to be, things are not going to be returning back to the way they were some time ago. Right, it's not going to be 90s anymore. It's not going to be even 2000s anymore. This is a new situation. It's not necessarily the Cold War situation, because there are still the channels of communication are open. But what we are here to expect is that Russia is going to continue pointing out unsuccessful policies of the US. This whataboutism, as it is called, this is going to definitely continue. It's somewhat a bit of a in Russian language. There's always this form which is "sam takoy." You are the one, so it's like a bit of a childish play, which sometimes, in my understanding, comes from the official position of Russia nowadays. Instead of, it's just that, to some extent, it is somewhat sad to see, if Russia wants to be such a strong and international and unique player international system, it is actually just doing what the US is doing and what everybody else is doing, meaning that they're not even trying to be better or showing that they're better. They're just basically just doing the worst things and saying that, yeah, well, everybody's doing that, we're going to do that as well. So it legitimizes the fact that others are doing the same thing. It legitimizes us to do that, instead of actually putting the foot down and saying, no, this is not right, we should do that and that instead. Let's try to make a world a better place. Well, obviously that's not on their agenda, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Bukovskis. We have another question from the audience.
Probably women working at the council. I have a question about something I've been following a lot lately. That's the expanding Russian footprint in Belarus. Since August, since the crisis erupted in August, Russia's been steadily expanding its military, economic, and political footprints, which is already large in the economic and political sense, but the military footprint has visibly expanded. Through kind of constant military exercises, Russia's effectively established a permanent military presence, I think what you can call it. They're talking about building a joint training facility in western Belarus, in Kroto, right near the Polish border. I was wondering how this affects the security calculus in the Baltic Nordic region, if at all. I mean, I'm sure it does affect it, but how do you think any of the panelists?
I will just repeat, I hope the microphone picked it up, but just in brief, Russia's presence in Belarus, how does that affect the security in the Baltic Nordic region? Dan?
Thank you. Gunilla might have a view on this too. I mean, I think the implication, unfortunately, of what Lukashenko has done has been to make him more dependent on Russia. He had been treading this fine line, being close, but not as close as Putin wanted. And I think now, given his domestic weakness, he's had to move that way, which is one result is what you said. So the question is, how do we respond best to that? I think we have been very careful, I think rightly so, not to lead with NATO on the Belarus issue, because you don't want to give Putin or Lukashenko pretext to say we are threatened by this massive military alliance, which is what they say. But we don't want to do anything to give them any evidence of that. And so I think it's right not to lead with NATO on this issue, and that's why what Lithuania has done, what some of the Baltic states have done, what the EU does on sanctions, what the US has tried to do as part of that, is a better strategic sort of response, realizing in the end, we are effective at the margin in a situation like this. But there's no reason we can't keep, naming and shaming. And, the Moscow mechanism, the OSCE, frankly, should be implemented. The OSCE has provided the most specific examples of repression and, subverting the elections of any institution, and we should build on that. Many OSCE states, it seems to me, should simply implement the recommendations of that group and not wait for the OSCE as an institution to do anything, which they can't because they're blocked. But that doesn't mean the recommendations can't be implemented by OSCE participating states. And there are a whole series of recommendations there, which I think could be more robust than what we're doing right now. So I don't think the appropriate response to that is a military response, is basically my answer.
Thank you. Another question for Karlis. Is there a clear leader among the 3 Baltic countries at the moment? Lithuania was just awarded the next NATO summit. Thank you, Andres.
Yes, thank you, Andres. It changes. Yes, I was just told to be diplomatic. It changes. It changes because I think we have seen. It depends. Again, my final point, which I was making in my intervention, it depends on state leaders. Occasionally, each of the Baltic states have had colorful state leaders. Again, we can discuss if everything is perfect or not. It's always a debate, but. Visible state leaders like either it was Tomas Henrik Ilves or it was Vaira Vytė Freiberga, Dalia Grybauskaitė, absolutely. Those are the examples when the politicians are there, and at that point, to a large extent, I believe there is this tendency that one of the Baltic states is kind of promoting all the others together with itself. So in this case, this is if I would need to point out one and also take into account where we currently are located, well, I guess you already guessed. Yeah, but I'm not objective on this one. So thank you, Andres, very much for this question. If I may, Sarma, immediately, I see that there is also a question by Megan Phillips on the significance of NATO's Stockholm center located in Riga, if that changes anything. It's a nice addition. They're active. They're active in doing, and it's of course it's not only in Riga where we have a NATO Center of Excellence. There is also one in Tallinn, and this geographical dispersion of the institutions is actually an important point, not only from the view of the organizations themselves, but from the Baltic states being recognized as trustworthy locations, if I may say so, of the activity and their credibility on those issues being recognized. So this is part of the diplomatic process.
Thank you. We have one more question from the audience, please.
Hi, I'm Helga from the Estonian Embassy to add a Baltic voice to the mix. But Professor Hamilton, I just wanted to thank you. I think you made an excellent point regarding resilience, and I think it ties very well into actually the China question, because we need to be resilient, mainly not only against Russia, but also the China threat, and that's where the resilience point comes in. But I think, and I'm very cautious of taking the role of our blocks or Nordics into account here, but I think the Nordic Baltic space is relatively resilient in comparison with the rest of our allies, whether it be in the European Union or in NATO. So I think my question is, how can we best sell the argument of resilience in the face of economic interests? And I think Nordic Baltics are relatively resilient due to different parts of our history, but there are other countries maybe in our different alliances that need more forward resilience, and I think actually Ukraine is doing sometimes even better at that than some NATO allies. They refuse to sell water switch to the Chinese, so I think they're doing well, but I think it's an internal problem that we need to solve, and how to best make the case that defense matters sometimes more than immediate economic returns.
Thank you. For those of us, just to repeat and closer to the microphone, briefly, the question is how to sell resilience in the face of economic issues. And you will elaborate more, Professor Hamilton.
Well, sitting here, your countries are the epitome of resilient nations. Just think of your history. You've had to be. So that's what I meant at the beginning. It wasn't a flattery. It is we can be guided by that sense of history and what it means to have to be resilient. Frankly, all of our Nordic colleagues have had traditions of resilience as well. If you're non-aligned or neutral, you're on your own. And those countries have had to develop their own systems. Finland, Sweden, have had their own systems as well. Norway also in its own way. And so I think for the United States, for instance, a big country, but we thought the oceans protected us. The idea that, these flows can interact, that you can implant ransomware, malware in dams, in the middle of the United States, crash down banks. That's not a concept that we know how really to grapple with. So I think we can learn from this, but it takes some time. And that's why I think the steps NATO has taken so far are welcome, but they're insufficient. Because this is a new dimension of security that we have to think about. It's not like the other core tasks of NATO. It's actually, if we're not resilient, none of the other core tasks matter. And so we should not make this a sub-theme, we should lift it. I think the strategic concept, if we maintain the other three core tasks, this should be number 4. It should be lifted at that same level, and we should operationalize the term so it's not just a buzzword, but it's actually we do something. NATO at the summit proposed now a planning process for resilience, which I think is quite interesting. But I come back to my point. It's still, even in the communique, they still said under Article 3. Article 3, interpreted as self-help, can be a trap because it means you're on your own. And I don't think any European country really can be on its own when it comes to resilience. In Article 3, if you read it really, it says self-help and mutual aid. That's what Article 3 says. And the mutual aid part of resilience has not been developed. So I think we need to do what I said, shared resilience, forward resilience. We need to have NATO, EU work on this better. It's actually, for all the talk of strategic autonomy, another topic, another session, resilience is the #1 issue of NATO-EU cooperation. It's not about anything else. It's actually resilience. So, so that's a door that's been opened. We should go through it. So in all these ways, and I come back to my last point, which the premise of resilience is democratic resilience. It's the resilience of democratic societies. And all of our societies, if we're honest, have been challenged on that front in recent years, including maybe almost particularly the United States. So Congressman Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, is putting forward, very robustly the idea that we have to anchor democratic resilience at the heart of NATO and not let it be a buzzword. And I agree with that. But we need to give it content. And I think we need to not only have a center of excellence in Romania, but you have to have something in NATO headquarters that holds countries accountable on resilience issues, on democratic resilience issues. So there's a whole bunch there, but it's really an important new area that we should develop.
Thank you, Dan, and we apologize to the School of Advanced International Studies for going a little bit above time. Thank you for letting us do this. Gunilla, just 1 minute, if you could answer the question, is it conceivable that Sweden could join NATO without waiting for Finland? And then we wrap up.
Sorry. It is hardly conceivable. Finland has not yet forgiven us for launching the EU application without informing them. There were some reasons behind it. Someone who was supposed to be informed was not available. but still, they haven't forgotten it, and we won't do it again. And also, there is, it would be very unfortunate on the whole if Sweden joined without Finland, because it would leave Finland in a terribly exposed position. We are having a problem with this issue. Sweden is more positive than Finland, but on the other hand, Sweden does not have a 1,300 kilometer border to Russia. And I remember when I was in Riga, I think 4 years ago at the Riga Dialogue, some Russian generals told me that if Sweden and Finland join, we have plenty of things that we can do to you, to harm you, in case you do something as foolish as that. And they already complain about our too close cooperation with NATO. So if we do it, we will be punished, and I think we will survive that punishment as well. But still, it is not as easy as if you are Ireland and decide to join. On the other hand, I think that most people have also understood that there are many, many things we can do without joining. We have the extraordinary close cooperation with NATO, and that is not done without, we are not particularly punished by that. So we are fine.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for this fascinating and meaningful exchange of thoughts. I think it's inspiring to both the academics and practitioners, and I'm sure we will continue to develop the thoughts that we discussed here. Thank you again to Dr. Daniel Hamilton, Dr. Gunilla Herolf, and Dr. Karlis Bukovskis, and of course to Ambassador Selga for welcoming us here in the embassy, both some physically and most of us virtually. Thank you.
Thank you.